The clock on the wall of Hamilton Tech's glass-walled conference room crept toward midnight, the city lights of Boston glittering like fallen stars against the darkness. Rebecca Hamilton stood at the head of the polished mahogany table, her tailored navy suit still crisp despite the late hour, her gaze fixed on the email displayed on the wall screen. The rejection from Walter Keller III in as many weeks glared back at her in stark black text against white. The final line burned into her vision. Your offer is nothing but an insult from American corporate vultures. 3 days they'd been at this. 3 days of strategizing, arguing, and watching their acquisition of Keller Toys slip further away with each passing hour. Rebecca's team of executives looked as battered as she felt, tees loosened, jackets, discarded coffee cups littering the table like casualties of a prolonged siege. 15 billion. That was the value of Hamilton Tech, the technology empire her father had built from nothing. And now, with tech giants circling like sharks, scenting blood, everything hinged on diversifying their portfolio with Keller's old-fashioned but profitable toy business. Without this acquisition, the hostile takeover would be inevitable. Rebecca tucked a strand of chestnut hair behind her ear, the gesture betraying a rare moment of uncertainty. At 42, she'd spent the last 5 years since her father's death becoming the shark other executives feared: cold, precise, lethal in the boardroom. She couldn't afford to fail now. Walter Keller is a sentimental old fool, Frank Donovan muttered, loosening his tie further. At 54, the senior board member had the weathered look of someone who'd survived decades of corporate warfare. His icy gaze swept over the exhausted team, a smirk playing on his lips. He's sitting on a gold mine and wants to talk about tradition. It's absurd. Our offer is more than generous, Rebecca snapped, her patience worn to a razor's edge. $10 billion for a company that still used hand-carved wooden molds. Any rational businessman would have jumped at it. But Walter Keller wasn't just a businessman. He was the third-generation patriarch of a family legacy, and they'd somehow insulted everything that legacy stood for. The team started debating again, voices rising with familiar arguments about leveraged buyouts, shareholder pressure, and legal loopholes. They'd been over this ground so many times it was becoming a well-worn path to nowhere. In the periphery of the heated discussion, James Miller moved quietly, efficiently, replacing full wastebaskets with empty ones, collecting abandoned coffee cups. At 46, he had the steady hands and economical movements of someone who had learned to be invisible in rooms full of power. The navy uniform of Hamilton Tech's maintenance department hung comfortably on his broad-shouldered frame, his salt and pepper hair trimmed short and neat. He'd heard every word of their 3-day war room session as he came and went servicing the executive floor during his evening shift. He heard their frustration, their increasingly aggressive strategies. They talked about Walter Keller as an obstacle, a fossil to be bulldozed. Not once did they talk about him as a man. Frank ran a hand through his silver hair, his frustration evident. We've tried everything at this point. His gaze drifted to where James was quietly collecting trash, and a cruel smile touched his lips. Maybe we should ask the janitor for his 2 cents. The room fell silent. Every head turned toward James. Before he could retreat with his cart, Rebecca locked eyes with him. A humorless, challenging smile touched her lips. He's right, she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. Close this $10 billion deal for me, and I'll bow to you. The laughter that followed was brittle and strained. James kept his expression neutral as he replaced the liner in the wastebasket. He had heard every word of their meeting, the shouting, the frustrated sighs, the increasingly aggressive strategies. They talked about leveraged buyouts, shareholder pressure, legal loopholes. They talked about Klaus Richter as an obstacle, a fossil to be bulldozed. He finished his task and turned his cart toward the door, his worn work boots silent on the polished marble. He just wanted to finish his shift and get home to Lucy. That was his world now. Simple, quiet, safe. But Rebecca's words, sharp and dismissive, caught him like a hook. He paused with his hand on the door, his back to the room. That's the problem, he said, his voice quiet but clear in the tense silence. Rebecca's head snapped up. What did you say? James turned around slowly. He looked at the most powerful woman in the city, at her tailored suit that cost more than his car, at the exhaustion and fury warring in her eyes. He was just the maintenance supervisor. He knew the rules: be invisible, be silent. But he couldn't stop the words. You're trying to buy a man's life's work. You think the price is the only thing that matters. You're wrong. Frank let out a short, incredulous laugh. He's serious? Serious? Rebecca stood her chair, scraping back harshly. She walked toward James until she was standing directly in front of him. She was taller than he expected in her heels, and her gaze was intense enough to feel like a physical weight. And what would you know about $10 billion deals? The question hung in the air, a challenge laced with disdain. I don't know anything about them, James admitted, his voice steady. He met her stare without flinching. But I know about fathers, and I know about German Americans. The executives exchanged confused glances. Rebecca's eyes narrowed. The sarcasm was gone, replaced by a dangerous curiosity. She waved a dismissive hand at the rest of the room. Everyone get out. I want to be alone with our new consultant. The command was absolute. Frank gave James a look of utter contempt as he filed out with the others, the heavy glass door clicking shut behind them. The sprawling, brightly lit conference room suddenly felt intimate, an arena with only two combatants. You have 1 minute to explain why I shouldn't have security throw you out of this building for good. Rebecca said, her voice low and lethal. My wife. James began the words tasting like old memories. She was German-American. Her grandparents came from Bavaria, not far from where the Keller family originated. Her father was a craftsman, a woodworker, not a factory owner. His hands were his legacy. He saw a flicker of something in Rebecca's expression. Impatience, maybe, but she didn't stop him. When we would visit her family, I'd spend hours in his workshop. James continued. I learned the language, but more than that, I learned the mindset. To men like her father, to men like Walter Keller, what they create is a part of their soul. It's not just a product, it's a promise. Your team approaches him with threats and spreadsheets. You're not just trying to buy his company, you're telling him his life has a price tag. And to him, that's the ultimate insult. Rebecca was silent, studying him. She was a woman who dealt in facts and figures, in market projections and shareholder value. He was talking about souls and promises. It should have been laughable. It wasn't. You speak German, she asked, a hint of suspicion in her voice. Fluently, he confirmed. I lived in Munich for 7 years working on international construction projects. That's where I met Elizabeth. She paced for a moment, the click of her heels the only sound. Frank thinks I'm failing. He's been waiting for this since my father died, waiting for me to stumble so he can take over. This deal has to happen. Her voice hardened. I don't have time for poetry and promises, Mr. Miller. I need a weapon, not a philosophy lesson. Respect isn't a philosophy, James countered softly. It's a strategy. It's the one you haven't tried. He thought of his daughter Lucy waiting for him at home. He needed this job. He should just shut up and walk away. But he thought of his late wife Elizabeth and the pride she had in her heritage. He couldn't stay silent. Rebecca stopped pacing and stood in front of him again, her expression unreadable. She was cornered and she knew it. Every high-priced expert she had hired had failed. Now in the middle of the night, a maintenance supervisor was telling her they were all wrong. It was insane. It was also the only new idea she'd heard in 72 hours. All right, Mr. Miller. She said, her voice a strange mix of disbelief and decision. You think you know how to talk to this man? She gestured toward the blank holographic display. Prove it. He stared at her, confused. Prove it how? Rebecca walked to the head of the table and picked up a tablet, tossing it to him. He caught it instinctively. You have until 600 a.m. She declared, her voice once again the cold, commanding tone of a CEO. When I walk into my office, I want a one-page proposal on my desk. A new strategy, your strategy. Tell me exactly what you would do to save this deal. She started for the door, then paused, turning back to him. If it's the sentimental nonsense you've been spouting in here, you're fired. But if it's something else, if it gives me even a sliver of hope, then we'll talk. She walked out, leaving him alone in the cavernous room, the tablet feeling impossibly heavy in his hands. He looked at the clock. It was nearly midnight. He had 6 hours to come up with a plan to save a $10 billion deal. 6 hours to justify the craziest risk he had ever taken in his life. The tablet felt cold and alien in his hands. James stared at the blank screen, a reflection of his own tired face staring back at him. A one-page proposal. He didn't know the first thing about corporate strategy. He didn't know buzzwords like synergy or optimization. He just knew what he felt, a deep instinctual certainty that their entire approach was a declaration of war on a man who valued peace. He didn't use the tablet. Instead, he walked over to the credenza and found a simple notepad and a pen. He sat back down at the massive empty table and closed his eyes, shutting out the glittering skyline of Boston. He thought of Elizabeth's grandfather Heinrich, a man whose hands were stained with wood polish and whose knuckles were swollen with arthritis, but who could craft a cabinet with the precision of a Swiss watchmaker. He remembered Heinrich telling him once in slow, careful German, "A man's workshop is the museum of his heart. Everything inside tells his story." Walter Keller wasn't a cabinet maker, but he was a toy maker. What was a poet if not a small engine of joy, a story waiting to be told? James began to write. He didn't write a proposal. He wrote a plan, a single, simple, shockingly human plan. When he finished, there were only a few paragraphs on the page. He tore it out, folded it neatly, and placed it in his shirt pocket. He spent the rest of his shift on autopilot, his mind a million miles away somewhere in the rolling hills of Bavaria, where Elizabeth's family had once lived before coming to America 3 generations ago. He got home just as the first hints of dawn were painting the sky. His apartment was small on the 3rd floor of a walk-up in Somerville, but it was clean and filled with the scent of the chamomile tea Lucy liked. He peeked into her room. She was asleep, her small form curled under a handmade quilt Elizabeth had sewn during her pregnancy, her breathing soft and even. For a moment, the weight of the world lifted from his shoulders. This was his $10 billion deal. This was the only thing that mattered. He showered, changed out of his uniform, and made 2 mugs of tea. When he came back into her room, she was stirring. "Hey, sleepyhead," he whispered, sitting on the edge of her bed. "Morning, or morning, Daddy," she mumbled, rubbing her eyes with small fists. "Did you have a good night at work?" "It was interesting," he said, handing her the mug adorned with the cartoon horses. He never lied to her. "I might have done something a little crazy." She sat up suddenly, more awake, her hazel eyes so like her mother's, widening with curiosity. "What kind of crazy?" "The kind of crazy that gets you in trouble or gets you a promotion," he said with a half smile. "I'm not sure which yet." She giggled, her blonde hair a tangled mess around her face. "I vote for promotion." He kissed her forehead. "Me too, kiddo. Me too." At 5:55 a.m., James walked back into the silent, imposing lobby of Hamilton Tech. He took the elevator to the top floor. Rebecca Hamilton's office was a corner suite with a view that seemed to stretch into forever. The lights were off, the space pristine and intimidating. He walked over to the massive glass desk, took the folded piece of paper from his pocket, and placed it squarely in the center. Then he turned and left his heart pounding a nervous rhythm against his ribs. Rebecca arrived at precisely 6:01 a.m. She wore a different suit, a sharp charcoal gray, and her expression was even harder than the night before. She didn't seem to have slept at all. She strode into her office, tossing her keys on a side table without breaking stride. Then she stopped. She saw the single folded piece of notepaper on her desk, not a printout, not an email. A piece of paper like a relic from a forgotten age. She unfolded it. The handwriting was neat, clean, and masculine. "Ms. Hamilton, you are not buying a company. You are asking a man to trust you with his family's soul. Stop sending lawyers. Stop sending accountants. Stop sending threats. Send a letter, a real one, handwritten not from a CEO, but from a parent. Write it in German. Tell him you understand what it means to build something to pass on to your child. Tell him you don't want to erase his legacy. You want to protect it for a new generation of children. Ask him to meet you not in a boardroom, but at his workshop. Let him show you his story. Don't talk about money. Talk about his first toy. Ask him what he wants his grandchildren to remember about him. This isn't a negotiation. It's an adoption. You have to prove you're worthy of his child." Rebecca read it 3 times. Her first reaction was a flash of hot anger. An adoption? Was he insane? This was a multi-billion-dollar transaction, not a family drama. This was the most simplistic, naive, and frankly insulting piece of advice she had ever received. She crumpled the note in her fist, then stopped. She smoothed it back out on her desk, the creases a testament to her frustration. She stared at the words, a parent to pass on to your child. She thought of her own daughter, Maddie, who was probably being dressed by the nanny right now, a girl she saw for maybe an hour a day, if that. What legacy was she building for her, a mountain of money and a mother who was never there? She pressed a button on her intercom. Get me James Miller from facilities. I want him in my office, now. A few minutes later, James stood before her desk. He looked tired, but his gaze was direct. This, Rebecca said, holding up the note with two fingers as if it were contaminated, is your grand strategy, a pen pal club. It's a sign of respect, James replied calmly. It's showing him you're willing to meet him on his terms and his language. And you think a letter is going to make him forget about the 9 zeros on our offer. It might make him see the person behind them, James said. You're a ghost to him, Ms. Hamilton, a name on a legal document. This makes you a human being. Right now, that's the only leverage you have left. She leaned back in her chair, her eyes scanning his face, searching for a crack, a hint of doubt. She found none. He believed every word he was saying. It was infuriating. It was also compelling. Every expert, every consultant had told her to be tougher, to squeeze harder. He was telling her to be softer. It was the one thing no one had dared to suggest. And I suppose you think you can write this magical letter, she challenged. I can translate it, he said. The words have to come from you. She was silent for a full minute, her fingers drumming a frantic silent rhythm on the arm of her chair. The fate of her company, her father's legacy, rested on this moment, on a choice between the brutal, logical world she knew and this leap of faith. All right, Miller, she said finally, the words sharp and decisive. We'll try it your way. James felt a wave of relief so profound it almost made him dizzy, but she wasn't finished. But, she added, leaning forward, her eyes pinning him in place, there's a condition. What condition? I'm not hiding behind a piece of paper. If this is about being human, then we do it face to face. The letter will be an invitation to a meeting. She stood up, a new determined light in her eyes. And you're not just translating it. You're coming with me to Ohio. If I'm walking into the lion's den, I'm bringing the lion tamer with me. James felt as if the floor had just dropped out from under him. Ohio, Miss Hamilton? I can't go to Ohio. I'm a maintenance supervisor. I have a daughter. I can't just leave the state. Rebecca waved a dismissive hand, already walking to her desk and tapping on her tablet. We have an HR department. We'll arrange a temporary leave of absence. As for your daughter, hire a sitter. The company will cover the expense. The casualness of her reply hit him like a slap. A sitter? I can't leave Lucy with a stranger for days. She's my daughter, not an inconvenience. The words were sharper than he intended, but the thought of leaving his child in the hands of someone he didn't know was a non-starter. Rebecca looked up from her tablet, her eyes flashing with annoyance. Mr. Miller, this is a multi-billion-dollar corporation, not a daycare. I need your expertise on the ground. Make the necessary arrangements. That's an order. Before James could argue further, the intercom on her desk buzzed. It was her personal assistant, her voice strained. Miss Hamilton, I'm sorry to interrupt, but it's your nanny on line 1. She says it's urgent. About Madeline. Rebecca's corporate mask tightened, but a flicker of concern crossed her face. She stabbed a button on her phone. What is it, Helen? She listened for a moment, her posture growing rigid. A fever of 103. Did you give her the medicine Dr. Evans prescribed? Another pause. I see. No, I'm in a critical meeting. I can't leave right now. Her knuckles whitened around the phone. Yes, I understand. Call the doctor and let me know what he says. She hung up, her jaw tight. She stared at the phone for a long moment, a war raging behind her eyes. For the first time, she didn't look like a CEO. She looked like a worried mother. Is your daughter okay? James asked softly, his anger forgotten. She'll be fine, Rebecca said, her voice a fortress. She gets these fevers. A pause, almost imperceptible. Helen knows the protocol. Lucy gets ear infections when she's stressed, James offered quietly. I used to think it was just a medical thing. Then I realized it always happened when I was working too much or when the anniversary of her mom's passing was coming up. Sometimes a fever isn't just a fever. Rebecca looked at him, her expression unreadable. His simple fatherly insight had breached a wall she didn't even know was there. He wasn't judging her. He was just telling a truth. What do you suggest I do, Mr. Miller? She asked the question laced with a strange, genuine curiosity. Cancel the trip. Let the company fall apart so I can go home and hold her hand. No, James said. I'd suggest you call her. Not the nanny. Her. Let her hear your voice. Tell her you love her and that you'll be home as soon as you can. 5 minutes. It's not about fixing the fever. It's about letting her know she's not alone in it. Rebecca stared at him, then at her phone. She said nothing. She simply turned away and began typing furiously on her tablet. Send me your daughter's details and the contact information for whoever will be watching her. My office will handle everything. Be here tomorrow at 7:00 a.m. with your passport. We'll work on the letter then. It was a dismissal, but as James left her office, he had the distinct feeling that something had shifted between them. Meanwhile, Frank Donovan was on the hunt. He saw James leave the executive floor, his expression dazed, a maintenance supervisor having a private meeting with the CEO for nearly an hour. It made no sense. He walked past Rebecca's assistant's desk, his smile predatory. Big day, Sarah, he said casually. Rebecca seems to be in a fighting mood. Are we finally making a move on the Kellers? Sarah, a young woman who was terrified of him, nodded nervously. I think so, Mr. Donovan. She's requested the company jet be prepared for a possible trip to Cedar Falls, Ohio. Excellent, Frank beamed. Just her and the legal team. Her and a consultant? Sarah said, checking her screen. A Mr. James Miller. Frank's smile didn't falter, but his eyes went cold. James Miller, the maintenance supervisor, a consultant, Rebecca was up to something desperate and foolish, and he was going to find out exactly what it was. The next morning, James sat opposite Rebecca at the same massive conference table from the other night. This time it was just the two of them. In front of her was a sheet of the company's finest linen stationery and a heavy, expensive fountain pen. All right, Mr. Miller, she said, all business. Let's write this letter. What's the opening line? No, James said gently. You write? I'll translate. I told you the words have to be yours. She scowled, but picked up the pen. She started to write her script sharp and angular. After a minute, she slid the paper across to him. To Mr. Walter Keller, CEO of Keller Toys, Inc. James shook his head. No, too formal. You're not writing to a CEO. You're writing to a grandfather. Start with, Sehr geehrter Herr Keller. Dear Mr. Keller, and don't mention his title. Rebecca sighed frustrated and started again. For the next hour they worked. It was a slow, arduous process. She would write a sentence in English full of corporate jargon. He would stop her. Don't say synergistic partnership, he'd say. Say you want to build a future together. Don't say brand legacy, he'd correct. Ask him about the first toy he ever carved for his son. He was forcing her to dig deeper, to move past the language of the boardroom and find the language of the heart. The more he pushed, the more frustrated she became. This is ridiculous, she finally snapped, throwing the pen down. I'm the CEO of a multi-billion-dollar company, and you have me writing like a schoolgirl. What does my relationship with my own father have to do with this? Everything, James said calmly. Your father built this company. Keller's grandfather built his. You both inherited a legacy you're trying to protect. That's your common ground. Tell him that. She stared at him, her anger slowly giving way to a grudging understanding. She picked up the pen and began to write again. This time the words flowed more easily. She wrote about her father, about the pride he took in his work. She wrote about her hopes for her own daughter, Maddie. By the time she was done, the page was filled with simple, honest, and powerful words. James took the letter and translated it his own handwriting, a careful, steady script beneath hers. When he was finished, he pushed it back to her. This is a good letter, Miss Hamilton. Rebecca, she said, her voice quiet. Call me Rebecca. She looked at the letter, then at him. The armor was gone, if only for a moment. Thank you, James. She sealed the letter in an envelope and sent it via International Express courier to Cedar Falls, Ohio, where Keller Toys had been headquartered for 3 generations. As the messenger left, a heavy silence fell between them. They had sent a message in a bottle across an ocean of distrust. Rebecca walked to the window, looking down at the city below. Well, Miller, she said, her voice barely a whisper, for both our sakes, I hope you were right. The next 48 hours were a unique form of torture for Rebecca. She was a woman of action, used to forcing outcomes and driving agendas. Now all she could do was wait. Every buzz of her phone made her jump. She found herself unable to focus in meetings, her mind constantly drifting to a workshop in a small Ohio town and the old man who held her company's future in his hands. James's words about Maddie's fever lingered like a persistent echo. That evening, for the first time in months, she left the office at 6:00 p.m. When she walked into her sprawling, silent penthouse apartment in Beacon Hill, her daughter Maddie was in the living room with Helen, the nanny listlessly pushing a doll in a toy stroller. Maddie looked up, her eyes wide with surprise. "Mommy, you're home." "I'm home, sweetie," Rebecca said, her voice a little unsteady. She knelt, a gesture that felt foreign and stiff. "How was your day, and how's your fever?" Maddie shrugged, her delicate features still flushed with the remnants of illness. "It's gone. Helen gave me the yucky medicine." She looked at her mother, a question in her eyes. "Are you staying for dinner?" The question twisted something in Rebecca's chest. "I am," she said, forcing a warm smile. "And I thought maybe after dinner we could read a story together. The one about the castle in the clouds." A small, genuine smile bloomed on Maddie's face. It was like watching a flower open after a long winter. "Really, really," Rebecca confirmed. That night, as she sat on the edge of her daughter's bed reading the familiar words, she felt a profound sense of peace that had nothing to do with stock prices or profit margins. James's words came back to her. Sometimes a fever isn't just a fever. He was right, and it terrified her. Across town, James was also preparing. He sat at his small kitchen table with Lucy, a plate of half-eaten spaghetti between them. He had just finished talking to Mrs. Jenkins, the kind elderly woman in the apartment next door who had been a surrogate grandmother to Lucy since Elizabeth passed away. She had agreed to have Lucy stay with her without a moment's hesitation. "So you're really going," Lucy asked, her fork tracing patterns in the pasta sauce, "on a big airplane with a big boss lady?" "I really am," James said, taking her hand. "It's a very important project, sweetie. It's to help the company." "Is the boss lady nice?" Lucy asked, her brow furrowed with concern. James thought for a moment. Nice wasn't the word he would use. Complicated, driven, powerful, maybe even scared. "She's learning," he said finally. "I think she's trying to be." Lucy seemed to accept this. "Okay, Daddy, but you have to bring me back something cool from Ohio." "It's a deal," he said, relief washing over him. He hated leaving her, but seeing the excitement in her eyes made it a little easier. This trip wasn't just about saving a company anymore. It was about building a better future for this little girl. While Rebecca and James focused on their children, Frank Donovan was focused on destruction. From his own lavish office, he made a secure call to a man named Greg Winters, a ruthless financial journalist at the Ohio Business Journal, with a reputation for taking confidential tips for the right price. "Greg, my friend," Frank said, his voice smooth as silk, "I have some information for you. Hamilton Tech is making a last-ditch effort to salvage the Keller deal. I heard Walter sent them packing." "He did," Greg's voice crackled back. "Word is he called them corporate vultures. Not exactly open to negotiation. But the CEO, Rebecca Hamilton, is unstable, desperate. She's flying to Ohio for a private meeting, and you'll never guess who she's bringing as her lead advisor." Frank paused for dramatic effect. "Her maintenance supervisor." There was a moment of stunned silence on the other end of the line. "You're joking." "I wish I were," Frank said with a sigh. "His name is James Miller. No credentials, no experience. She's clearly had some kind of breakdown. The board is preparing to vote her out. I'm giving you the exclusive. You can frame it as a story of a once great American company crumbling under the leadership of its erratic, emotional CEO. It will be a bombshell." "Frank," Greg said, his voice now greedy with excitement, "this is pure gold. Consider it done." Frank hung up the phone, a cruel smile playing on his lips. He couldn't stop Rebecca from getting the meeting, but he could make sure that by the time she arrived, Walter Keller would see her as a fool and a madwoman. The ground would be salted before her plane even touched down. The package arrived at Rebecca's office on the second day. It wasn't from a courier. It was delivered by a private messenger from Cedar Falls. It was a simple, unmarked wooden box. Rebecca's assistant brought it in her hands, trembling slightly. Rebecca dismissed her and closed the office door. She stared at the boss, her heart hammering. She called James, who was in the middle of his shift, and put him on speakerphone. "It's here," she said, her voice tight. "A package from Ohio." "Open it," James's voice urged, calm and steady through the speaker. With trembling fingers, Rebecca sliced the tape and opened the flaps. Inside, nestled in a bed of wood shavings, was a small, exquisitely carved wooden bird. It was a nightingale, its details so perfect it looked like it might burst into song. Beneath it was a single thick card. She picked it up. On it was a line of elegant, old-fashioned script. "What does it say?" she whispered, her breath catching in her throat. "A man's workshop is his heart. My heart is open. On Friday at noon," James translated, "he's inviting us in, Rebecca. This is more than I hoped for." Rebecca sank into her chair, the wooden nightingale clutched in her hand. A wave of disbelief and elation washed over her. It had worked. The crazy, impossible human strategy had actually worked. "He's saying yes," she breathed. "He's saying more than that," James said. "He's welcoming you home." 12 hours later, they were sitting across from each other in the plush cabin of the Hamilton Tech Gulfstream jet. The night sky was a blanket of stars outside the window. The roar of the engines was a low hum as they began their ascent, leaving the Boston lights far below. The wooden nightingale sat on the polished table between them, a silent testament to the strange journey they were on. Rebecca looked at James, the maintenance supervisor in a borrowed suit, who somehow understood the world better than all of her high-priced advisors. The sarcasm was gone from her voice, replaced by a weary, cautious respect. "No turning back now, Mr. Miller," she said. James met her gaze, a small, confident smile on his face. "I wasn't planning on it, Rebecca." The 8-hour flight passed in a strange, suspended reality. For the first time, Rebecca wasn't buried in spreadsheets or taking hostile calls. The quiet hum of the engines was a world away from the chaos of her life. She found herself watching James. He wasn't looking at the stock market reports on the cabin screen or reading financial papers. He was staring out the window at the endless carpet of clouds, a look of quiet contemplation on his face. "What are you thinking about?" she asked the question, surprising even herself. James turned from the window. "I was thinking about the last time I made this trip. It was with my wife, Elizabeth. We were bringing Lucy to meet her grandparents for the first time. She was only 6 months old." A sad, gentle smile touched his lips. Elizabeth was so proud. She said it was like bringing her heart home to show her family. Rebecca was silent for a moment, processing the intimacy of his words. "You must miss her very much." "Every day," he said simply. "After she passed, the world just got loud. I was a project manager at Crawford Engineering, a good one. But it was all deadlines and budget fights and angry clients. I'd come home and all that noise was still in my head. I couldn't hear my own daughter. So I quit. I took the maintenance job because it was quiet. It let me be a father again." His story was the opposite of hers. He had walked away from the noise she had spent her entire life chasing. "My father was the opposite," she found herself saying, her voice softer than usual. "He was the heart of Hamilton Tech, a brilliant inventor. He could design anything, but he hated the business side. He used to call the boardroom the vampire's castle. When he got sick, the board members, people like Frank, started circling. They saw him as weak. So I had to become the shark. I had to be tougher and smarter and more ruthless than all of them just to protect what he built." "And you did," James said, his gaze unwavering. "But maybe you forgot how to stop being the shark when you leave the castle." His words hit their mark, sharp and true. She was the shark everywhere. In the boardroom, at home, even with her own daughter. It was the only way she knew how to survive. They landed at a private airfield outside Columbus, Ohio, under a crisp blue autumn sky. The air smelled different, cleaner, laced with the scent of fallen leaves and distant rain. A sleek black Cadillac SUV was waiting for them. As they settled in for the hour-long drive to the small town of Cedar Falls, where Keller Toys was headquartered, Rebecca felt a flicker of something she hadn't felt in years. Hope. Then her phone buzzed with a news alert from a financial wire. The headline in bold made her blood run cold. "Hamilton Tech in turmoil. Erratic CEO bets billions on unorthodox tactics amidst merger collapse." "What is it?" James asked, seeing the color drain from her face. She turned the phone so he could see. He read the first few paragraphs, his expression hardening. The article, written by Greg Winters, was a brutal character assassination. It painted Rebecca as a desperate, failing leader on the verge of a breakdown. It mocked her mysterious new strategy and cited anonymous sources from within her own board. Frank, without a doubt, who expressed grave concerns for the company's future. The most venomous line was buried in the third paragraph. Her latest gambit reportedly involved sidelining her entire experienced legal team in favor of a single unqualified consultant with no corporate background, a move one source called a shocking and irresponsible display of instability. The hope she'd felt moments before evaporated, replaced by a cold, sickening dread. Frank had done it. He had poisoned the well. Walter Keller was a proud traditional man. The moment he read this, the meeting would be over. He would never do business with a woman the world was calling a fool. "It's over," she whispered, the words tasting like ash. She leaned forward, her voice hollow. "Driver, turn around. Take us back to the airport." The driver glanced in the rear-view mirror, awaiting confirmation. "No," James said, his voice firm and clear. Rebecca turned to him, her eyes blazing with a desperate fury. "Did you not just read that, James, he's painted me as a lunatic? Keller will be laughed out of his own town if he even meets with me now. Frank won." "No, he didn't," James insisted, his voice cutting through her panic. He tapped the phone screen. "This isn't a sign of your weakness, Rebecca. It's a sign of his fear. He's not doing this because he thinks you're going to fail. He's doing this because he's terrified you're going to succeed." He leaned closer, his intensity holding her in place. "You think Walter Keller, a man who has resisted corporate vultures for 50 years, cares about some gossip columnist in Columbus? He's a man who reads character, not headlines. Frank just handed us a gift." "A gift?" she asked incredulously. "How is this a gift?" "Because now when you walk into that workshop, you're not just a CEO. You're an underdog. You're a woman who is being attacked by the very vampires your father warned you about. You're going to walk in there, look him in the eye, and prove that everything in this article is a lie. You're going to show him your character." Her breathing was ragged, her mind racing. Every instinct screamed at her to flee, to retreat to her fortress of lawyers and fight back on familiar ground. But James's logic was a steady anchor in the storm of her fear. He was right. Running would be an admission of guilt. She looked at him, at the quiet, unshakable strength in his face. He wasn't just a maintenance supervisor. He was her only ally. She took a deep, shuddering breath. She looked at the driver in the rearview mirror, her voice no longer hollow, but filled with a new hard-won resolve. "Keep driving," she said. "We have a meeting to get to." The town of Cedar Falls was like stepping into a postcard from a different era. Main Street was lined with brick buildings from the early 1900s, American flags flapping in the autumn breeze. The air was crisp, and the distant sound of a church bell echoed through the valley. In the window of nearly every shop, there were handcrafted wooden toys, soldiers, dolls, intricate puzzles, all bearing the small, elegant Keller Toys logo. This wasn't just where Walter Keller worked. This was his kingdom. Their hotel was a historic inn called the River Bend. As Rebecca swept into the lobby, her sharp suit, intense energy, a stark contrast to the cozy wood-paneled surroundings, the woman at the front desk looked up. Her polite smile froze for a fraction of a second. It was a flicker of recognition, quickly masked, but Rebecca saw it. The poison had arrived before they had. The check-in was professionally cold. Rebecca could feel the eyes of the few patrons in the lobby on her. They were whispering. She felt a familiar defensive anger rise in her, but she crushed it down. "You are not a shark," she told herself. The thought feeling foreign. "You are an underdog." Once in her suite, she paced the room, the beautiful antique furniture feeling like a cage. The article had stripped her of her power. Here she wasn't a CEO. She was a headline, a joke. She picked up the phone and called James's adjoining room. "They know," she said the moment he answered. "The woman at the desk, the people in the lobby, they've all read it. They're looking at me like I've lost my mind." "Good," James' voice came back infuriatingly calm. "Let them." "Let them," she repeated, her voice rising. "James, my reputation is the only weapon I have. Frank just melted it down for scrap." "No," he said. "Your character is the only weapon you have. Your reputation is just what people like Frank want you to think matters. Did you bring the nightingale?" Rebecca looked at the small wooden bird sitting on her nightstand. "Yes." "Then you have everything you need. Don't walk in there and apologize for the article. Don't even mention it. Walk in, put the bird on his workbench, and let it speak for you. He's testing you, not you. He wants to see if you'll be rattled by gossip. Show him you're not. His certainty was an anchor. She took a deep breath, her panic receding. Okay, she whispered. Okay. At 5 minutes to noon, they walked to the Keller Toys workshop. It wasn't a factory. It was a sprawling Victorian-style building that smelled of fresh-cut pine and varnish. Inside, it was surprisingly quiet, the air humming with the gentle whir of unseen machines. A stern-looking woman led them through the main floor where a handful of artisans, old and young, were painstakingly painting tiny details on wooden figurines. No one looked up. The silence was heavy, deliberate. They were shown into a large, sunlit office that was more of a personal museum than a corporate space. The walls were lined with shelves holding toys from the past century, a vibrant history of childhood. A massive, worn oak desk sat in the center of the room. Behind it stood Walter Keller. He was a formidable man with a shock of white hair, a weathered face, and eyes the color of a winter sky. He wasn't smiling. He gestured to two simple wooden chairs remaining standing himself. Miss Hamilton, he said, his German-accented English as sharp and precise as a chisel. I see you have made quite a name for yourself in my town before even arriving. He held up a folded newspaper from his desk. It was the Cedar Falls Gazette. The headline was visible even from across the room, a reprint of the Columbus story. Rebecca's stomach plummeted. James had been wrong. This was the first and only thing he wanted to talk about. This was the end. Her mouth went dry. Every corporate instinct screamed at her to defend, deflect, and attack. She could feel James's eyes on her. Show him your character. Show him your She ignored the newspaper. She ignored the bait. She reached into her bag, her hand closing around the smooth, familiar shape of the wooden nightingale. She walked forward, not to the chairs, but to a long, scarred workbench against the wall, a place of honor covered in half-finished carvings and well-worn tools. She gently placed the small bird on the bench, its delicate form a stark contrast to the heavy industrial space. Then she turned back to Walter Keller, looked him directly in the eye, and spoke the German words James had coached her on, her accent clumsy, but her voice clear. Ein Vater schützt, was liebt. A father protects what he loves. The silence that followed was absolute. Keller's icy gaze flickered from Rebecca's face to the nightingale on his workbench, then to James, who stood quietly by the door. He was seeing them. Not the caricatures from the newspaper, but two people who had traveled across the country to offer a gesture of respect. A long moment passed. The stern mask on Keller's face didn't vanish, but something in his eyes softened, the hard frost beginning to thaw. He had expected a fight, a denial, an argument. He had not expected this. He gave a slow, deliberate nod. The newspaper is for wrapping fish, he said gruffly, tossing it into a wastebasket beside his desk with a thud of finality. He then looked at them, a new calculating light in his eyes. The meeting is not here, he announced. He walked toward a heavy, unmarked wooden door at the back of his office. Come, there is something you must see. He opened the door and gestured for them to follow, leading them away from the office and deeper into the heart of his kingdom. Rebecca and James exchanged a quick, uncertain glance. They had passed the first test, but the real one, it seemed, had just begun. The heavy wooden door opened not into another part of the factory, but into a quiet, almost sacred space. It was a recreation of a turn-of-the-century workshop. The air carried the scent of aged wood-oiled steel and something else, history. Antique tools hung in neat rows on the walls. In the center of the room was a simple scarred workbench, and on it a single half-finished wooden horse. Glass cases lined the walls, filled not with mass-produced products, but with prototypes, early models, and faded photographs of generations of Kellers with sawdust on their clothes and pride in their eyes. Walter Keller walked over to the workbench and picked up a small, worn carving knife. This was my grandfather's, he said, his voice a low rumble. He started Keller Toys in this very room with this knife. He did not dream of a $10 billion valuation, Miss Hamilton. He dreamed of making a toy that a child would love so much they would pass it down to their own child. He led them to one of the cases and pointed to a simple, slightly clumsy-looking wooden soldier. This was the first toy my father designed. He was 8 years old. He gave it to me on my 5th birthday. It is the most valuable thing I own. Rebecca understood at once. This wasn't a meeting, it was a lesson. He was showing her the soul of his company page by page. The old Rebecca the shark would have been looking at her watch, impatient to get to the numbers. But the woman standing here now, the one who had just reconnected with her own daughter, was captivated. My father kept his first prototype in his desk drawer, she said, her voice soft. It was a memory she hadn't accessed in years. It was a circuit board. He called it the engine of the future. He was so proud of it. After he died, the board wanted to have it encased in glass for the lobby. I said no. I keep it in my office. Sometimes late at night, I take it out. She paused, the confession, feeling strangely intimate. Just to hold it. Walter looked at her, truly looked at her for the first time. He saw not a corporate raider, but a daughter trying to protect her father's dream. He gave a slow nod of understanding. James stood back, watching the exchange. He was a bridge between two worlds. When Rebecca struggled to find a word to express a concept, he would quietly supply the German phrase. When Walter told a story rooted in a local Bavarian tradition his family had brought to America, James would give Rebecca a brief whispered explanation. He wasn't leading the conversation. He was simply making sure they could hear each other's hearts. Back in Boston, Frank Donovan was seething. He was on the phone with Greg Winters, his voice a low snarl. What do you mean he met with them? Your article was supposed to make her a pariah. It did, the talk of the town. But my source at the inn says they went to the workshop at noon as planned. They were in there for over an hour. Find out what happened in that room, Frank commanded, and find me everything you can on this James Miller. A man doesn't just go from a maintenance closet to a CEO's private jet. There's a story there, a dirty one, I'll bet. Find it. I want him ruined. I want them both ruined. He slammed the phone down. His plan had failed, and now he was going to war. He immediately called an emergency meeting with 3 other board members who shared his dissatisfaction with Rebecca's leadership. They gathered in a private dining room at the Boston Harbor Club, far from Hamilton Tech's corporate headquarters. Rebecca Hamilton has lost her mind, Frank announced without preamble. She's in Ohio right now trying to salvage the Keller deal with a janitor as her advisor. When this falls apart, and it will, we need to be ready to move. I'm proposing we invoke Article 7 of the company bylaws. Vote of no confidence. Calvin Peters, the oldest member of the board, frowned. That's extreme, Frank. We can't just remove the founder's daughter based on one bad deal. It's not just one bad deal, Frank countered. It's a pattern of erratic behavior culminating in this farce. The stock is already sliding based on the rumors. Imagine what will happen when investors learn she's entrusted a $10 billion acquisition to a maintenance man. What do we know about this Miller? Asked Diane Schultz, tapping her manicured nails on the table. Frank smiled thinly. Not enough, yet. But I'm digging, and I promise you there's dirt there. No one gives up a career to push a broom without a reason. If Rebecca pulls this off, we'll look like fools, cautioned Martin Reeves, the 4th member of their cabal. Frank leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. She won't pull it off. I've made sure of that. In the quiet of the workshop, Walter Keller finally led them back to his office. The atmosphere had changed completely. The hostility was gone, replaced by a fragile, tentative respect. He stood behind his desk, his expression serious. My company is not for sale, Miss Hamilton. Rebecca's heart stopped. After all this had she still failed? However, Walter continued, a faint smile touching his lips for the first time. I am an old man, and my own son has no interest in this world. Keller needs a new guardian, a partner, not an owner. He laid out his terms, and none of them were about money. He wanted a guarantee that not a single worker in Cedar Falls would lose their job. He wanted a permanent seat on the board for his family to protect the brand's integrity. And he wanted a multi-million-dollar investment to create a new apprenticeship program to teach the art of toy making to the next generation. It wasn't an exit strategy, it was a succession plan. Yes, Rebecca said without hesitation, we can agree to those terms. Walter nodded, seemingly satisfied, but there was one final test. He walked to a heavy safe in the corner of the room, turned the dial, and pulled out a thick leather-bound journal. Its pages yellowed with age. He placed it gently on the desk between them. This was my grandfather's first design journal, he said, his voice thick with emotion. It contains the founding principles of our company, the philosophies behind every toy we have ever made. He pushed the book toward Rebecca. Go back to your hotel. Read this, both of you. If you understand what is written in these pages, if you understand the responsibility that comes with them, Then we will have a deal. We will talk numbers tomorrow morning at 9. Rebecca stared at the journal. It felt heavier than any legal contract. He was handing her his family's soul, trusting her not to crush it. This was no longer about a transaction. It was about earning the right to be a part of a legacy. Back in the quiet warmth of Rebecca's hotel suite, they sat at a small table, the antique journal placed between them, like a sacred text. The room was silent except for the soft rustle of the old pages and James's low, steady voice as he translated the elegant, spidery German script. The journal wasn't what Rebecca had expected. There were no technical schematics or manufacturing plans. It was a book of philosophies. Each page contained a sketch of a toy, and beside it, handwritten notes about the child who would play with it. A toy soldier is not a model of war. James translated one passage. He is a guardian of the bedroom door, a silent friend who stands watch while a child sleeps. His uniform must be brave, his expression kind. Another page showed a simple wooden train. The journey of a toy train is not from one end of the rug to the other. It is a journey through jungles and over mountains that exist only in the mind. Its wheels must be strong enough for imaginary worlds. They read for hours. Rebecca saw her own daughter Maddie in the pages. She saw James' daughter Lucy. She saw the profound, almost spiritual responsibility that Walter Keller and his family felt toward the children of the world. And with every page, she felt the cold, hard shell around her own heart would continue to melt away. She realized the truth in the note James had left her. You are trying to buy a heart with a calculator. My father, she said, her voice barely a whisper, he used to say that his circuit boards were like little brains waiting for someone to give them a purpose. I was so focused on making the brains faster and more profitable. I think I forgot all about the purpose. James looked at her, his expression full of a warmth and understanding that made her feel seen in a way she never had before. It's not too late to find it again. The air between them grew thick with unspoken emotion. She was no longer a CEO, and he was no longer a maintenance supervisor. They were just two people, two parents who understood the weight of a legacy. She found herself looking at his hands as he traced the German script, strong, capable hands that had pushed a maintenance cart but could just as easily decipher a company's soul. Without thinking, she reached out and placed her hand over his on the open page. He stopped reading and looked up at her. His gaze was intense, and in it, she saw a reflection of the same startling, terrifying, and wonderful feeling that was blooming in her own chest. The world seemed to shrink to the space between them. It was a moment of perfect, fragile connection. And then her phone rang, shattering the silence with a shrill, violent buzz. Annoyed, she pulled her hand back, the spell broken. The screen showed it was her head of communications, David Chen. It was the middle of the night in Boston. This could only be bad news. What is it, David? Rebecca, I'm so sorry to wake you, but you need to see this. It just broke. It's a catastrophe. His voice was shaking with panic. A link popped up on her screen. Her blood ran cold. She tapped the link, her heart pounding. The headline was even more vicious than the last one. Exclusive: the janitor and the CEO corporate con man's past exposed Hamilton Tech in freefall. What is this? She whispered. James leaned closer, his face grim as she read the words aloud. Each one was a hammer blow. The article, again by Greg Winters, was a masterpiece of character assassination aimed directly at James. Sources have uncovered the shocking past of James Miller, the so-called consultant behind Rebecca Hamilton's recent bizarre behavior. She read, her voice trembling. Records indicate Miller has a sealed juvenile file for fraud and was the subject of a grand larceny investigation that was quietly dropped years ago. Our sources allege he took the menial job at Hamilton Tech with the specific intent of getting close to the famously reclusive CEO, preying on her known grief over her father's death to orchestrate a corporate shakedown. The lies were breathtaking in their cruelty. It went on painting him as a calculating predator and her as his gullible, emotionally unstable victim. It concluded with a quote from an anonymous board member, Frank, undoubtedly stating that emergency measures were being considered to wrest control of the company from a CEO who is clearly under malicious influence. The room was deathly quiet. James stared at the screen, his face pale, his expression one of utter shock and violation. They had taken his quiet life, his simple, honorable story, and twisted it into a weapon to destroy them both. The deal was dead. Walter Keller was a man who valued integrity above all else. He would never partner with a company led by a supposed fool and a con man. Frank hadn't just won. He had burned the entire kingdom to the ground. Rebecca looked from the poisonous words on the screen to the man sitting beside her. The man who had shown her more integrity and wisdom in 3 days than her entire board had in 3 years. The man whose hand she had just been holding. Her old survival instincts screamed at her. Cut him loose. Denounce him. Save the deal. Save yourself. It was the logical move. It was what the shark would do. James finally looked up from the phone, his eyes meeting hers. He didn't look angry. He just looked defeated. Rebecca, he said, his voice rough. I'm so sorry. He expected her to run, to blame him, to call security. He was waiting for the axe to fall. She stared at him, the battle for her own soul raging in her eyes. The fate of her company, her future, and the man she was realizing she was falling for, all rested on what she would say next. Rebecca looked at James's defeated face, and the last remnants of the cold, calculating shark inside of her died. In its place, a cold, protective fury rose sharp and pure. She reached out not for the phone to call her lawyers, but for his hand. She squeezed it hard. Don't you dare apologize, she said, her voice a low, dangerous command. He didn't attack a janitor, James. He attacked my partner. This isn't a PR crisis. It's a declaration of war, and Frank just made the mistake of his life. James looked up, stunned by the ferocity in her eyes. He saw no fear, no doubt, only a resolute, unwavering loyalty that stole his breath. What do we do? The meeting is in 9 hours. We can't disprove lies like these overnight. No, Rebecca agreed, her mind already shifting into high gear. We can't, so we don't play his game. She stood up and began to pace, not with anxiety, but with predatory energy. He wants to fight in the mud with lies and headlines. Fine, we'll fight in the light with the truth. We walk into that meeting and we own every single word of it. Own it, James asked, confused. How? We tell him everything, she said, turning to face him. We show him in the article. We tell him exactly who you are. A father who took a quiet job to raise his daughter. We tell him who Frank is, a snake who is trying to sabotage this company for his own gain. No defense, no excuses, just the truth. Walter Keller values character. Let's show him ours. It was a terrifyingly bold strategy, a gamble on the character of a man they barely knew. Okay, James said, a slow, determined nod. Okay. Rebecca's lips curved into a dangerous smile. And while they were telling the truth, my team is going to be finding it. She grabbed her phone and dialed a number from memory. It was answered on the first ring. Markham, wake up your team. I want everything on Frank Donovan. I want his bank records, his phone logs, any offshore accounts. I want to know who he's been talking to, who he's been paying. I don't care if it's legal. I don't care what it costs. I want the proof that he's behind these articles. You have until my meeting starts. That's 8 hours. Go. She hung up without waiting for a reply. She was no longer just protecting her father's company. She was fighting for the man standing in front of her. The sun rose on the small Ohio town. They didn't sleep. They drank black coffee and talked. Not about the deal, but about their lives, their children, their hopes. They were forging an alliance, a bond that felt infinitely stronger than any corporate contract. At 8:55 a.m., they walked out of the inn and into the cool morning air. The walk to the workshop was silent. They were two soldiers walking into the decisive battle armed with nothing but the truth. When they entered Walter Keller's office, he was standing behind his desk. The warm, respectful atmosphere of the previous day was gone. The air was frigid. On his desk, beside the leather-bound journal, was a copy of the morning's paper. James's face staring up from the front page. Walter's expression was one of profound disappointment. I have read the news this morning, he said, his voice heavy. He looked at James. It seems I was mistaken about you. It was a blow. Rebecca opened her mouth to speak, to launch into their planned defense, but James put a hand gently on her arm. He stepped forward. He looked the old toy maker in the eye and began to speak not in English, but in fluent German. Herr Keller, he began, his voice clear and steady. Everything in that article is a lie except for one thing. I am a maintenance supervisor, and I am proud of it. He told him everything. He spoke of Elizabeth, of her love for her German-American heritage. He spoke of her sudden illness and of the promise he made to her to always put their daughter, Lucy, first. He explained how the noise of the corporate world had become too much and how he had chosen a simple, quiet life so he could be the father Lucy deserved. "My name is James Miller," he said, his voice thick with an emotion that needed no translation. "I am not a con man. I am a father. The only thing of value I have to pass down to my daughter is my character. It is not for sale, not to him," he pointed at the newspaper, "and not to anyone." He finished, his chest heaving, his honest, painful story laid bare in the silent office. Walter Keller stared at him, his stern facade unmoving. But something deep in his winter blue eyes was shifting. He was a man who understood legacy. He was a man who understood the love of a parent. He had just heard the truth, raw and undeniable. Just as the silence became unbearable, Rebecca's phone vibrated in her pocket. She pulled it out. It was a secure message from Markham. It contained a single attachment. She opened it. It was a scanned copy of a bank transaction, a wire transfer for $51,000 sent 3 days ago from a shell corporation in the Cayman Islands registered to Frank Donovan to a private account belonging to the journalist Greg Winters. The smoking gun. She took a breath. She looked up from her phone, first at James with a look of fierce pride and then at Walter Keller. "Herr Keller," she said, her voice ringing with cold, hard certainty, "I believe a man's character is defined by his actions, and I have just received proof of Mr. Donovan's." Rebecca turned the phone around the screen, glowing with the damning evidence. Walter leaned forward, his sharp eyes scanning the details of the transaction. He read the names, the dates, the amount. His expression, already softened by James's story, hardened into a mask of pure contempt. Not for them, but for the man who had tried to poison their meeting. He straightened up, the full weight of his 70 years of integrity behind him. He looked from the phone to Rebecca's determined face, and then to James, whose quiet strength had just won the day. "In my life," Walter said, his voice a low, powerful rumble, "I have found there are two types of people, those who build and those who break. This man Donovan is a breaker." He gave a decisive nod. "I prefer to do business with builders." He extended a hand across the desk to Rebecca. "Ms. Hamilton, you have a deal." Rebecca took his hand, a wave of triumphant relief washing over her. They had done it. Against all odds, they had done it. She didn't let go of the moment. With Walter as her witness, she pulled out her phone again and made a call. It was 3:00 a.m. in Boston. She didn't care. "Walter, wake up," she said to her chief legal counsel. "Convene an emergency board meeting for 9 a.m. I am invoking Article 7, Section 4 of the Corporate Bylaws, removal of a board member for actions deliberately harmful to the company. I have irrefutable proof of corporate sabotage and defamation committed by Frank Donovan. His security credentials are to be revoked immediately. His assets are to be frozen. I want him out of my company by the time my plane touches down." Her voice was steel. It was the voice of the shark. But now it was wielded in the service of justice. That evening, the deal wasn't celebrated in a fancy restaurant. Walter Keller insisted they come to his home, a warm, rambling house filled with the laughter of his grandchildren. They ate a simple, delicious meal at a long wooden table. For the first time, Rebecca saw James truly relax, charming Walter's wife and making the children giggle as he told them stories. She saw the man he was outside of the crisis, the kind, steady father, and she felt herself falling completely in love. Later, as the stars came out in the clear Ohio sky, they stood outside in the garden. "You saved me today, James," she said quietly. "Not the company, me. You reminded me of the person I was supposed to be." "You were always that person, Rebecca," he said, turning to her. "You just built walls so high you couldn't see over them." He reached out and gently brushed a stray strand of hair from her face. "I'm glad I got to meet the woman behind the walls." In the soft glow of the porch light, surrounded by the quiet peace of a life well lived, she leaned in and he met her halfway. Their kiss was gentle at first, then deeper, a culmination of all the trust, respect, and admiration that had grown between them in the crucible of the last few days. It wasn't the end of a deal, it was the beginning of everything else. 6 months later, Rebecca Hamilton stood at the window of her new office. It was the same corner suite, but it felt different. The massive, intimidating glass desk was gone, replaced by a round table of polished walnut. On the wall was a framed photo of her, James, Maddie, and Lucy, all of them laughing on a picnic blanket in Boston Common, their faces flushed with genuine joy. Frank Donovan was a bitter memory, his name now synonymous with corporate treachery in the industry circles of Boston. The partnership with Keller Toys, built on a foundation of trust rather than dominance, was a roaring success. Hamilton Tech's diversification had not only fended off tech giants' hostile takeover attempt, but had actually boosted the company's valuation by 20%. The market had responded enthusiastically to the unconventional alliance between cutting-edge technology and old-world craftsmanship. The first line of smart wooden toys, traditional Keller designs, enhanced with Hamilton Tech's adaptive learning algorithms, had sold out within days of release. Rebecca was now known not as a shark, but as a visionary leader who championed integrity as fervently as she did innovation. The business publications that had once questioned her stability were now hailing her as a pioneer of a new corporate ethos. James's office was down the hall. His role had evolved naturally from that fateful trip to Ohio. He was now Hamilton Tech's Director of Strategic Partnerships, a title they had created together. His job was to be the company's heart, to find the human element in every decision they made. He still walked the floors regularly, but now he wasn't invisible. He was the most respected man in the building, the embodiment of the company's renewed commitment to valuing character over credentials. The boardroom that her father had once called the vampire's castle had transformed as well. Gone were the predatory tactics and cutthroat politics that had defined the Frank Donovan era. The board now included Walter Keller himself, whose perspective on legacy and craftsmanship had proved invaluable in balancing the drive for innovation with respect for human impact. Rebecca's phone buzzed with a message from James, meeting with the apprenticeship candidates in 10 minutes. Bringing donuts. The good ones from Mike's, not the cardboard from the cafeteria. She smiled, warmth spreading through her chest. Their relationship had deepened gradually over these months, growing from professional respect to genuine friendship and finally, inevitably, to love. They had taken it slowly, mindful of their children, their professional responsibilities, and the scrutiny that came with Rebecca's position. But there was no denying the magnetic pull between them, the sense that they had found in each other exactly what they had been missing. The new apprenticeship program was the crown jewel of their partnership with Keller. It combined old-world woodworking techniques with modern design principles, creating a pathway for young artisans to preserve traditional crafts while adapting to contemporary markets. It was funded not just by Hamilton Tech, but by a consortium of companies who believed in their vision of sustainable heritage-based manufacturing. Rebecca checked her watch, a vintage mechanical piece that had belonged to her father, not the sleek digital model she'd worn before. She had time for one more call before the meeting. She dialed Maddie's school, confirming she would pick her up personally for her dentist appointment that afternoon. 6 months ago, she would have delegated this to Helen without a second thought. Now these small moments with her daughter were non-negotiable priorities on her calendar. As she ended the call, her eyes fell on the small wooden nightingale sitting on her desk. She picked it up, running her fingers over its intricately carved feathers. It had become something of a talisman for her, a reminder of the moment when she had chosen to lead with her humanity rather than her armor. Walter had noticed her attachment to it and had presented her with a matching one for Maddie, saying that sometimes a child needs her own guardian too. The aftermath of Frank's downfall had been more complex than she'd anticipated. The emergency board meeting she'd called from Ohio had been brutal but decisive. The evidence of his sabotage was irrefutable: the wire transfers, the leaked emails to Greg Winters, the secret meetings with Tech Giant's acquisitions team. The board had voted unanimously to remove him, and the company's legal team was still pursuing civil damages for his breach of fiduciary duty. What Rebecca hadn't expected was the wave of revelations that followed. Once Frank's protection was gone, a dozen employees came forward with stories of his bullying, his manipulation, his systematic undermining of anyone he saw as a threat to his ambitions. It became clear that he had been creating a toxic culture throughout the company for years, positioning himself as the only solution to problems he himself had engineered. The cleanup had been arduous but cathartic. Rebecca had worked closely with HR to address the damage, to restore a sense of security and fairness to a workforce that had been silently suffering under Frank's influence. The process had forced her to confront her own complicity, how her isolation in the executive suite had left her blind to the day-to-day realities of her employees' experiences. James had been instrumental in this transformation. His years in maintenance had given him insights into every corner of the company, from the custodial staff to the administrative assistants to the engineers. He knew who was struggling, who was thriving, who needed support, and who had potential that was being overlooked. His perspective had been invaluable as they rebuilt the company culture from the ground up. A knock at her door pulled Rebecca from her thoughts. James stood in the doorway, a box of donuts in one hand and a tablet in the other. He wore a charcoal suit now instead of a maintenance uniform, but his essence remained unchanged, the same steady presence, the same quiet confidence, the same gentle smile that still made her heart skip a beat. Ready to meet the future of American craftsmanship. These kids are amazing. One of them carved a working wooden combination lock, no metal parts. His eyes sparkled with genuine excitement. Rebecca grabbed her jacket. Lead the way, partner. The word partner had taken on multiple meanings between them, evolving from a professional designation to something far more personal. They walked together down the corridor, their steps in natural synchrony. The conference room was filled with 12 young people ranging from recent high school graduates to mid-career professionals looking for a change. They came from diverse backgrounds: a fourth-generation carpenter from Maine, a former tech worker who'd discovered woodworking during burnout recovery, a refugee from Sudan who had learned carving from his grandfather. What united them was passion, skill, and a deep respect for the traditions they were seeking to preserve. Walter Keller himself had flown in from Ohio for this meeting. At 70, he moved more slowly now, but his eyes remained sharp, missing nothing as he assessed each candidate's work samples displayed around the room. This, he announced, holding up a delicately carved music box, is why we do this, not for profit margins or market share. For this moment when human hands create something that will outlive them, that will bring joy long after they are gone. The session lasted 3 hours every minute, filled with enthusiasm and creative energy. The candidates presented their work, discussed their visions, and engaged in spirited debate about the balance between tradition and innovation. By the end, all 12 had been accepted into the program, with Walter insisting that they couldn't bear to turn away a single one of these promising artisans. As the room cleared, Rebecca found herself standing with James and Walter looking out at the Boston skyline. My grandfather would not believe this, Walter mused, his German accent thickening with emotion. That his little workshop would lead to this, a new generation carrying forward what he began. He would be proud, James said, his hand finding Rebecca's in a gesture that had become natural between them. As would your father, Walter nodded to Rebecca, both of you honoring legacies while building your own. After Walter departed for his hotel, promising to return for dinner with his wife Rebecca, and James retreated to her office. The afternoon light slanted through the windows, casting long shadows across the floor. They had a rare moment of quiet in a day usually packed with meetings and decisions. I got the house, James said, breaking the comfortable silence. The one in Cambridge with the backyard for the girls. The offer was accepted this morning. Rebecca's eyes widened. James had been house hunting for weeks, looking to move from his small apartment into something that would give Lucy more space as she approached her adolescent years. The Cambridge property was perfect, a Victorian with good schools nearby and room for a workshop in the back where James could teach Lucy the woodworking skills he'd been learning from Walter. That's wonderful, Lucy must be thrilled. She is, and terrified. Change is hard for her. A shadow crossed his face. It's the first home she'll have without her mom's touch in it. Rebecca squeezed his hand. We'll help her make it her own. Maddie's already planning a sleepover. The relationship between their daughters had evolved nearly as remarkably as their own. Initially cautious of each other, the girls had bonded over their shared experience of having a single parent suddenly thrust into a new relationship. Lucy, older and still processing her grief for her mother, had taken on a protective role toward 8-year-old Maddie. In turn, Maddie's exuberant spirit had drawn Lucy out of her shell, giving her permission to embrace joy again. Speaking of the girls, James said, checking his watch, aren't you supposed to pick up Maddie for her dentist appointment? Yes, and I'm actually leaving on time for once. Rebecca gathered her things, a simple act that represented a profound change in her priorities. Will we see you both for dinner? Helen's making her famous lasagna, and Maddie would love to hear about the house. We'll be there. Lucy's bringing the blueprints. She wants to show Maddie where their secret hideout will be. Rebecca paused at the door, struck by a sudden wave of gratitude for this new life they were building. James, do you ever think about how differently this all could have gone if you hadn't spoken up that night in the conference room? Every day, he replied, his voice soft with wonder. I almost didn't. I almost just walked out that door. What made you stay? He considered the question, his gaze turning inward. I think I saw something in you that reminded me of myself after Elizabeth died. Someone so focused on protecting what they loved that they'd forgotten how to actually live. His eyes met hers, clear and direct. I couldn't walk away from that. The dentist appointment went smoothly, Maddie chattering the entire way home about Lucy's new house and all the adventures they would have there. Rebecca listened, asking questions and laughing at her daughter's elaborate plans for tree houses and secret passages. This easy companionship with her child was still new enough to feel miraculous. For too long, their interactions had been brief, distracted moments between Rebecca's work commitments. Now she was present, fully engaged in her daughter's world. At home, Helen had outdone herself with dinner preparations. The apartment smelled of garlic and basil, and the dining table was set with the good china, a silent acknowledgement that this was more than a casual meal. Lucy and James arrived promptly at 7, Lucy clutching a roll of blueprints nearly as tall as she was. The evening unfolded with a natural warmth that still sometimes caught Rebecca by surprise. The girls spread the blueprints across the living room floor, plotting their domain with the seriousness of generals. James and Helen debated the merits of different pasta shapes with surprising intensity. Rebecca moved between them, all, refilling wine glasses, answering questions about load-bearing walls, retrieving colored pencils for the girls' annotations. This, she realized, was what her father had tried to tell her in his final days. The circuits are nothing without the connections, Becca, he'd whispered. His voice weakened by illness, but his mind still sharp. At the time, she thought he was delirious, mixing up his technical terminology. Now she understood. The company, the wealth, the power, they were meaningless without these human connections, these moments of shared joy and purpose. After dinner, as James helped with the dishes, despite Helen's protests, Rebecca's phone buzzed with an email from Walter. The subject line read simply, "For your consideration." She opened it to find preliminary designs for a new line of toys, traditional wooden puzzles, embedded with subtle technology that could adapt to a child's developing skills. The concept merged Hamilton's adaptive algorithms with Keller's craftsmanship in a way that enhanced rather than replaced the physical experience. James, look at this, she called, holding out her phone. Yeah, ma'am. Walter's been busy. He dried his hands and came to look over her shoulder, his proximity sending a pleasant warmth through her body. That's brilliant, he murmured. The tech is invisible but responsive, the kind of thing that augments imagination instead of replacing it. Exactly what we've been talking about. Technology that serves humanity, not the other way around. She turned to face him, their faces close enough that she could see the flecks of amber in his hazel eyes. This could be the defining product of our partnership. Which partnership? He asked, his voice low and intimate. All of them, she answered, unable to stop the smile spreading across her face. Later, after the girls had been tucked in, Maddie in her own bed, Lucy in the guest room that was increasingly becoming her room, Rebecca and James sat on the balcony overlooking the Charles River. The city lights reflected on the water, creating constellations below to match those above. A bottle of wine sat between them. Half empty, their conversation having meandered through topics professional and personal. I had a call from Stanford today, James said during a comfortable lull. They want me to give a guest lecture to their MBA class on ethical leadership and authentic corporate culture. Rebecca raised an eyebrow. Professor Miller, it has a nice ring to it. That's what's so surreal about all this. 6 months ago, I was changing light bulbs and emptying trash cans. Now I'm being asked to teach future CEOs. He shook his head in disbelief. Sometimes I wake up and wonder if I dreamed the whole thing. If you did, then I'm having the same dream. She reached for his hand, but I don't think either of us could have imagined this. Definitely not, although I did always hope Lucy would find a friend like Maddie. His expression softened as he mentioned the girls. They're good for each other. They are, and they're adjusting to us better than I expected. The word us still felt new on her tongue, a delicious secret, despite the fact that their relationship was now common knowledge at Hamilton Tech. They had been careful taking things slowly for the sake of their daughters and their professional reputations. But there was no denying the deepening bond between them, the sense that they had found in each other a rare and precious understanding. "I've been thinking about that," James said, his voice thoughtful. "About us, the four of us, I mean. The house has plenty of room, you know. If you and Maddie ever wanted to. James Miller, are you asking us to move in with you?" Rebecca's pulse quickened, a mixture of excitement and trepidation flooding through her. He met her gaze steadily. "I'm asking if it's something you'd consider. Not right away, but maybe as a step towards something more permanent." The word permanent hung in the air between them, laden with possibility. Rebecca took a deep breath, organizing her thoughts. 6 months ago, she would have recoiled from such vulnerability, such commitment. Now she found herself leaning into it, drawn to the security of building a life with someone who saw her, truly saw her. "I would consider it," she said finally, "but we'd need to be sure the girls are ready, and we'd need to think about what it means for us professionally." "Of course, no rushing." He squeezed her hand. "I just wanted you to know where my head is, where my heart is." Where is that exactly?" The question came out softer than she intended, revealing more of her need for reassurance than she usually allowed herself to show. James turned to fully face her, his expression serious but warm. "With you, Rebecca, with this family, we're building piece by piece. I'm all in." The simplicity and certainty of his declaration washed over her like a wave, clearing away the last of her doubts. "So am I," she whispered, leaning in to kiss him. The next morning dawned clear and bright, the kind of crisp fall day that showcased Boston at its most beautiful. Rebecca woke early, her mind already buzzing with ideas sparked by Walter's email. She slipped out of bed, careful not to wake James, who had stayed over in what was becoming a comfortable routine. In the kitchen, she found Helen already up preparing breakfast with quiet efficiency. "Good morning, Miss Hamilton. Coffee's ready." "Thank you, Helen." Rebecca accepted the mug gratefully. "And please, after all this time, I think you can call me Rebecca." Helen's professional demeanor softened slightly. "Old habits. Will you all be having breakfast together?" "Yes, I think so. James doesn't need to be at the office until 9, and I've cleared my morning for Maddie's school presentation." This simple domestic exchange, planning a family breakfast, discussing schedules, filled Rebecca with a quiet joy. It was so ordinary, so far from the high-stakes corporate maneuvers that had consumed her life for years, and yet it felt infinitely more valuable. The presentation at Maddie's school went better than expected. Her class had been working on heroes in our community, and Maddie had chosen to present about toy makers, specifically Walter Keller. Rebecca sat in the back of the classroom, watching her daughter confidently explain how wooden toys were made and why they mattered. James had helped her prepare, sharing what he'd learned from Walter and even arranging a video call so Maddie could interview the toy maker himself. Seeing her daughter's passionate interest in something connected to the company, not as an obligation or a birthright, but as a genuine curiosity, stirred something deep in Rebecca. Her own relationship with Hamilton Tech had always been complicated by her father's expectations and her sense of duty. She wanted something different for Maddie, a relationship with their family legacy that was chosen rather than imposed. After the presentation, as they walked back to the car, Maddie skipped ahead, buoyed by the praise from her teacher and classmates. "Mom, do you think I could be a toy maker when I grow up? Or maybe design smart toys like you and Mr. Keller?" "You can be anything you want to be, sweetie, and if you're interested in toys, I'm sure Walter would love to teach you more." Rebecca watched her daughter absorb this, the seriousness with which she considered her future at the ripe age of 8. "Maybe Lucy and I could make toys together. She's really good at drawing designs." "That's a wonderful idea. You two would make a great team." Maddie was quiet for a moment, her skipping slowing to a walk. "Mom, are you and Mr. James going to get married?" The question, asked with a child's directness, caught Rebecca off guard. We care about each other very much, but getting married is a big decision. We're taking our time to make sure it's right for everyone, especially you and Lucy." "I think it would be right," Maddie said with the conviction of someone who had given the matter serious thought. "Lucy needs a mom and I need a dad, and you and Mr. James need each other. It makes sense." Out of the mouths of babes, Rebecca thought, smiling at her daughter's simple logic. "You're pretty smart, you know that." "I know." Maddie grinned her moment of philosophical reflection, passing as quickly as it had come. Can we get ice cream before we go home? The rest of the morning passed in a blur of ice cream and playground time, a rare weekday outing that Rebecca treasured. By the time they returned to the apartment, it was nearly noon. She had just enough time to change before heading into the office for her afternoon meetings. As she was gathering her things, her phone rang with a call from the Hamilton Tech reception desk. Ms. Hamilton, there's a Mr. Parker here to see you. He says he's from Tech Giant and it's urgent. He doesn't have an appointment. Rebecca frowned. Tech Giant had been notably silent since their failed takeover attempt. What could be so urgent that their representative would show up unannounced? Tell him I'll be there in 30 minutes. Have him wait in the small conference room and let James know. When she arrived at the office, she found James already in the conference room with their unexpected visitor. Michael Parker was Tech Giant's chief strategy officer, a slender man with rimless glasses and a reputation for ruthless efficiency. He stood as Rebecca entered, extending his hand with a corporate smile that didn't reach his eyes. Ms. Hamilton, thank you for seeing me on such short notice. I apologize for the intrusion, but what I have to discuss couldn't wait. Rebecca shook his hand, her CEO persona sliding into place seamlessly. Mr. Parker, this is an unexpected pleasure. I believe you have already met James Miller, our Director of Strategic Partnerships. Parker's smile tightened almost imperceptibly at the introduction. Yes, we were just getting acquainted. Mr. Miller has quite an interesting background. The subtle emphasis on interesting set Rebecca's internal alarms ringing. She gestured for Parker to sit, taking a chair beside James rather than at the head of the table, a deliberate positioning that communicated their united front. So what brings Tech Giant to our doorstep today? She asked, her tone pleasantly neutral. Parker placed a slim folder on the table. I'll be direct, Ms. Hamilton. We've been impressed by your partnership with Keller Toys, particularly the integration of adaptive learning technology into traditional play formats. Our market research indicates that you've tapped into something significant, a growing parental desire for tech that enhances rather than replaces hands-on experiences. Rebecca exchanged a brief glance with James. This was precisely what Walter had articulated in his email the previous night. We believe in technology that serves humanity, Mr. Parker. It's a core principle of our approach. Indeed, and it's a principle that aligns with certain initiatives within Tech Giant as well. He opened the folder revealing charts and projections. I'm here to propose a collaborative venture, not an acquisition, but a true partnership. Tech Giant's global distribution network, combined with Hamilton Keller's design philosophy, could transform the educational toy market worldwide. The proposal was unexpected and on its face enticing. Tech Giant's reach was unparalleled, their resources vast. A partnership could accelerate their vision exponentially. But Rebecca had learned to look beyond the surface of such offers. An intriguing proposition, she said carefully. But I'm curious about the timing. 6 months ago, Tech Giant was attempting a hostile takeover of my company. Now you're suggesting a collaborative relationship. What changed? Parker had the grace to look slightly uncomfortable. Strategies evolve based on market realities, Ms. Hamilton. The Hamilton Keller success has demonstrated that there's more value in your approach than we initially recognized. Additionally, he cleared his throat. There have been some leadership changes at Tech Giant since the previous strategy was implemented. Frank Donovan's allies on your board, James asked, his insight cutting to the heart of the matter. Parker's surprise at James's perception was evident. You're well informed, Mr. Miller. Yes, there were certain board members who favored a more aggressive approach. They are no longer setting our strategic direction. Rebecca leaned forward, her gaze direct. Before we discuss this further, I need to understand something clearly. What role would Walter Keller and his company play in this partnership? His legacy and his people are non-negotiable priorities for us. We fully respect Mr. Keller's position. His expertise and traditional methods would remain central to the collaboration. In fact, we would propose expanding the apprenticeship program to a global scale, creating centers of excellence for woodcraft and traditional toy making in multiple countries. The meeting continued for over an hour with Parker outlining a vision that was, Rebecca had to admit, compelling. Tech Giant was offering resources and reach without demanding control, a stark departure from their previous approach. The proposal respected the core values of both Hamilton Tech and Keller Toys, while providing opportunities to expand their impact. As Parker left promising to send detailed documents for their review, Rebecca and James remained in the conference room processing the unexpected development. "What do you think?" she asked, valuing his perspective more than any of her high-priced consultants. James considered the question carefully. "The offer itself is solid, better than I would have expected from tech giant, but I'm concerned about their motivation. Corporations don't have sudden moral awakenings." "No, they don't," Rebecca agreed, "but individuals within them can change course based on evidence. We've proven our model works both commercially and ethically. It's possible they simply recognize a good opportunity. Possible, but not entirely convincing." James's natural caution, the same quality that had made him speak up that night in the conference room, was asserting itself. "I think we need to understand who's really driving this at Tech Giant before we proceed." Rebecca nodded, already forming a plan. "I'll have Markham look into their recent leadership changes, board minutes, anything that might give us insight into their true motivations." She paused, a smile tugging at her lips. "Look at us being all strategic and suspicious." "Professional hazard." James returned her smile. "We've both been burned before." "Yes, but we've also taken chances that paid off." She reached for his hand across the table. "Like you speaking up that night. Like me listening. Like Walter Keller giving us a chance despite every reason not to." Their eyes met in shared understanding. The past 6 months had taught them both that sometimes the greatest risks led to the greatest rewards in business and in life. They would approach this new opportunity with appropriate caution, but also with the openness that had brought them this far. That evening, as promised, they called Walter to discuss the tech giant proposal. The elderly toy maker listened attentively as they outlined the offer, his silence on the other end of the line growing longer as they concluded. "So they wish to take our little idea and make it global," he said finally, "to spread our philosophy of craftsmanship and respect for childhood to children around the world." "That's what they're proposing," Rebecca confirmed, "but we wanted your perspective before proceeding. This affects your legacy as much as ours." Walter was quiet again, and they could hear the creak of his workshop chair as he rocked thoughtfully. "You know, when my grandfather came to this country, he carried only two things with him: his carving tools and a dream that children would find joy in what he created. He never imagined his toys would travel beyond our small town." His voice grew wistful. To think that his philosophy could now reach children in Asia and Africa, in places he never even heard of. There is something beautiful in that possibility. "There is," James agreed, "but we want to make sure it's done right with integrity. We won't proceed unless we're confident that the partnership truly honors what you've built." "I trust your judgment," Walter said simply. "Both of you. You have shown me that there are still people in business who understand what truly matters. If you believe this path is right, then Keller Toys will walk it with you." The vote of confidence from Walter settled something in Rebecca's mind. They would proceed cautiously but openly, bringing the same human-centered approach to this potential global partnership that had defined their work so far. 3 days later, they convened a joint meeting with the Hamilton Tech Board and Walter Keller to review Markham's findings on Tech Giant's motivations. The picture that emerged was complex but ultimately promising. Tech Giant's new CEO, a woman named Elaine Chen, had indeed been orchestrating a shift away from the aggressive acquisition strategies of her predecessor. She had a background in educational technology and a personal interest in preserving traditional forms of play alongside digital innovations. More importantly, Tech Giant was facing growing regulatory scrutiny and public backlash over concerns about screen addiction and privacy issues in their children's products. A partnership with Hamilton Keller, with its emphasis on ethical, human-centered design, offered them not just commercial opportunities, but a chance to rehabilitate their image in the crucial family market. "They need us as much as we could use them," Rebecca concluded, addressing the assembled board members. "And that creates a balance of power that could make this a truly equitable partnership." The board voted unanimously to proceed with preliminary negotiations with strict parameters to protect the core values of both Hamilton Tech and Keller Toys. Rebecca and James would lead the negotiating team, with Walter providing guidance on all matters related to craftsmanship and tradition. As the meeting concluded, one of the newer board members, a woman who had replaced Frank's ally after his removal, approached Rebecca with an observation that caught her by surprise. You know, when you first brought James into the executive team, many of us were skeptical. Not because of his background, but because relationships between executives can complicate corporate governance. She glanced between Rebecca and James, acknowledging the personal dimension that everyone knew existed but rarely discussed directly. But watching you work together today, I see why it works. You balance each other. You check each other's blind spots. It's actually strengthening our decision-making, not compromising it. The comment stayed with Rebecca throughout the day, a validation of something she had felt intuitively but hadn't fully articulated. Their personal connection didn't distract from their professional responsibilities, it enhanced them. James's perspective complemented hers, his caution balancing her ambition, her strategic thinking, sharpening his intuitive understanding of people. That night, as they prepared dinner together in her kitchen, a domestic routine that had become one of Rebecca's favorite parts of the day, she shared the board member's observation with James. She's right, he acknowledged dicing tomatoes with the precision he brought to everything he did. We are better together. I've never had a professional relationship where I felt so in sync with someone's values while still bringing something different to the table. Me neither. And honestly, I've never had a personal relationship that felt this, she searched for the right word, complementary either. Like we're each filling in what the other was missing. James set down his knife, turning to face her fully. Rebecca Hamilton, are you getting sentimental on me? His tone was teasing, but his eyes were serious, searching hers. Maybe I am. She stepped closer, the onion she'd been chopping forgotten. Maybe you've turned the shark into a human being after all. You were always human, he said softly, reaching out to tuck a strand of hair behind her ear. You just forgot how to let yourself be vulnerable, how to trust. I trust you, she whispered, the words carrying the weight of all they had been through together. With my company, with my daughter, with my heart. In the quiet of her kitchen, surrounded by the mundane trappings of domestic life, half-chopped vegetables, a pot of water beginning to boil, the distant sounds of the girls playing in Maddie's room, Rebecca felt a certainty settle over her. This was it. This was the life her father had wanted for her, even if neither of them had been able to see it clearly. Success measured not in acquisitions and stock prices, but in moments of connection and legacies preserved in families built and strengthened. 6 weeks later, on a bright Saturday morning, a small group gathered in the garden of James's new Cambridge home. The closing had finalized the previous week, and though most of their furniture was still in boxes, they had decided not to wait any longer for this moment. Walter and his wife had flown in from Ohio. Helen was there along with a few close friends from both their lives. Maddie and Lucy stood together, dressed in matching blue dresses, their excitement barely contained. Under an arch of autumn flowers, Rebecca and James exchanged simple, heartfelt vows. No elaborate ceremony, no corporate politics, to navigate just two people committing to build a life together, witnessed by those who mattered most to them. When I was at my lowest, James said, his voice steady as he held Rebecca's hands, I thought the best I could hope for was a quiet life, a safe harbor for Lucy and me. I never imagined finding someone who would challenge me to step back into the world, to use my voice again, to believe that I still had something to offer beyond my own small circle. You didn't just give me back my ambition, Rebecca. You gave me back my courage. Rebecca blinked back, tears overwhelmed by the journey that had brought them to this moment. James, you saw me when I had forgotten how to see myself. You reminded me that the legacy worth protecting wasn't just a company, but the values that built it. You showed me that true strength isn't about control or power, but about having the courage to be vulnerable, to connect, to love. You and Lucy have made our house a home and our life a shared adventure. They exchanged rings, simple bands of polished wood with a thin line of gold running through the center, custom made by one of Walter's master craftsmen, symbolizing the fusion of tradition and innovation, warmth and strength that defined their partnership. The reception was held in the backyard with tables set up under the trees that were just beginning to turn gold and crimson. Walter offered a toast, his German accent lending a distinctive rhythm to his words. In my culture, we have a saying, Das Herz gibt dem Handwerk Seele. The heart gives craftsmanship its soul, Rebecca and James. You have shown us that this is true not just in making toys or building companies, but in creating a family. You have crafted something beautiful together, something that will outlast all the deals and business ventures, a home where love and respect are the foundation, where tradition and innovation dance together, where children learn by example what it means to live with integrity and joy. As the afternoon mellowed into evening, Rebecca found herself sitting on the back porch steps with James watching the girls chase fireflies in the gathering dusk. Walter and his wife were deep in conversation with Helen about traditional Bavarian recipes. The scene was peaceful, ordinary, and utterly perfect. So, James set his arm around her shoulders. Mrs. Miller Hamilton, what's next on the agenda? Global toy domination, revolutionizing corporate America. Building that treehouse the girls keep talking about. Rebecca laughed, leaning into his embrace. All of the above, I think. But maybe we start with the treehouse. Some foundations need to be built by hand. James kissed the top of her head, his voice warm with promise. Whatever we build next, we build it together. In that moment, surrounded by their blended family, with the weight of his ring on her finger and the future stretching out before them, Rebecca knew they had closed the most important deal of all, the one where everyone won, where value was measured in joy rather than dollars, where success meant having someone to share it with. Sometimes she reflected watching Lucy teaching Maddie how to cup her hands around a captured firefly. The greatest risks aren't the ones you take in boardrooms or global negotiations. They're the ones you take when you lower your defenses and let someone see the truth of who you are. And sometimes the most valuable assets can't be listed on a spreadsheet or protected by contracts. They're built day by day, choice by choice, in the quiet moments when you choose connection over control, vulnerability over armor, love over fear. Rebecca Hamilton Miller had finally learned what her father had tried to teach her, that business was ultimately about building things that mattered, things that lasted. And nothing mattered more. Nothing lasted longer than the bonds between people who chose each other, who saw each other's true worth, who built something together that neither could have created alone.